What unearthly horror did that girl gaze upon? What went on in that laboratory where a man actually dared to play God?
Man plays God, man accidentally turns himself into a horrific fly. Today, we'll be talking about the original Fly and the Fly remake, David Cronenberg's body horror masterpiece. I'll break everything down, we'll compare, we'll contrast, and I'll let you know which version I prefer. But the main thing I want to talk about is why both of these movies still hold up so well, and what are the deeper themes buzzing around under the surface of these two different yet oddly similar adaptations. Please note, spoilers are ahead for both movies. The original Fly is a top-tier 50s sci-fi horror. A man turning into a fly is an idea that's pretty out there, but overall the movie is played straight. The subject matter is taken seriously, and for me it works. Kurt Newman directed the original Fly. The cast featured David Hedison as our doom scientist, Patricia Owens as Helene, his loving wife, and America's master of horror.
I'm Vincent Price.
I'm a fan of Vincent Price, so I love that he features here as Andre's brother, Francois Delame. He's one of the biggest names in the movie, however he only plays a supporting role. But he's still crucial to the story and even gets a decent amount of screen time. Now you might think a movie from the late 1950s wouldn't feature much gore.
Madame!
This movie actually opens with a horrific scene of a man crushed to death in a mechanical press. Up front we learn the man who was killed was our lead, Andre Delame. Well, that was fast. But the question as to why he was killed is what sets the story in motion. So the first part of this movie is a mystery, which is unraveled in a flashback. Andre's wife, Helene, recounts the tragic events that led to Andre's death to his brother Francois and the police inspector. Shockingly, Andre's wife flat out admits she was the one who killed him. Initially, she refuses to offer all the grisly details, so the real intrigue as the movie plays out is connecting the dots and exploring why she killed her husband. As the movie flashes back, we meet Andre and his family in much happier times. It's clear this family was living a pretty idyllic life. Andre was a brilliant and ambitious scientist experimenting with a top-secret matter transporter, aka the Disintegrator Integrator. You have to love that name. It's a groundbreaking invention that could transport objects by breaking them down to the atomic level and reassembling them in a receiver elsewhere. Of course, the machine did have a few glitches. And by glitches, I mean at one point, when Andre tested it by trying to transport their pet cat, the animal's atoms were scattered into oblivion, which I actually found to be pretty disturbing. Eventually, his wife Helene noticed Andre had been down in a basement lab for a mighty long time. She goes down and finds him with a black cloth over his head. Yup, you guessed it. Andre experimented on himself. This is where the movie really picked up speed. And you feel for Andre's wife because out of nowhere, she's forced to deal with this insane and tragic situation. And as for Andre, he's stuck communicating with his wife the only way he can, with typed notes and knocking. Andre revealed that he tried to transport himself, but a common housefly slipped into the chamber with him, and the results were catastrophic. As the movie continues, Helene struggles to locate the missing fly, which apparently has a human head and left arm. So there's a fleeting chance that Andre could reverse his transformation. However, we already know how things will go down from the opening, so this objective seems hopeless. As time runs out, Andre begins to lose it. His fly half begins to corrupt his mind and what's left of his humanity. After Helene, Philippe, and even their maid fail to catch the elusive fly, Andre tries one last-ditch effort to make himself human again, but that too fails. Completely out of options and out of time, Andre destroys his invention and torches all of his notes. He then asks his wife to accompany him to his brother's factory so she could help him end his life in a hydraulic press. So now the dots are connected, and we pretty much wrap up this tragic tale. But wait, the tragedy doesn't end there. In the aftermath of Helene's confession, the inspector is convinced she's insane and charges her with murder. However, as she's being hauled away, young Philippe tells his uncle Francois that he spotted the fly they'd been searching for trapped in a web in the garden. The two men locate the fly, and sure enough, it has Andre's head and his arm. Good luck getting that image out of your brain. Just as the spider is about to eat the hybrid fly, the inspector crushes them both with a rock. Knowing full well absolutely nobody on Earth would believe any of this, the inspector and Francois settle on a cover story. They declare Andre's death as suicide, so Helene will be let off the hook for murder. With that, we get a somewhat happy ending. Helene is reunited with her son, and we see the hint of a new family take shape, with Uncle Francois stepping up as a father figure. Francois told young Philippe that his father was an explorer in an unknown land who died advancing science. So you can see Francois was trying to keep his brother's spirit alive, and with that, Philippe replied that when he grew up, he wanted to be just like his father.
The return of the fly, seeking revenge with 1,000 eyes.
Slow down, Philippe. Not sure how well that's going to work out. To gain a better understanding of the themes presented in The Fly, we can refer back to its source, the 1957 short story by French-British writer and war vet George Langeland. The short story first appeared in Playboy magazine. For the most part, the 1958 movie adaptation was faithful to Langeland's tale. Post-World War II, the horrors of the atomic age, and a looming threat of destruction was pretty much hammered into everyone. Needless to say, distrust of science, technology, and the potential horrific consequences of man going too far was fertile ground for sci-fi authors and movie studios. With that in mind, it's easy to see why The Fly was such a hit. Beyond tapping into the internalized fears of the era, the movie is also entertaining and well made. Now to be clear, the original Fly isn't a non-stop thrill ride. It's a slow-paced movie, especially by modern standards. It concentrates on character work over spectacle. Patricia Owen shined in this area, and considering everything her character goes through, that was no easy feat. You also feel sympathy for the young boy Philippe, as played by Charles Herbert. Philippe is without a father, and to make matters worse, his mother is suspected of going mad.
They think I'm mad, don't they?
Of course, I have to discuss the special effects work in the original. After all, The Fly is a classic movie monster. I found the actual Fly mask to be a real highlight. The iconic headpiece was crafted by makeup artist Ben Nye. It took 10 weeks to create. David Hedison was solid as a well-meaning, brilliant scientist, but for me, his turn as the Fly is what stood out most. The gestures, twitching, and body language by Hedison truly sold the creature. It felt like a legit struggle, a man fighting a beast deep inside that was trying to take control. Andre's science lab and the disintegrator integrators all look great as well. Vintage 50s sci-fi. The Fly was one of the earliest occasions for audiences to see human beings instantly transported from one location to another. Predating the transporters we'd see years later on Star Trek. By then it would be commonplace to see Scotty beaming people up and down from planet to planet all the time. Lastly, I like that the conclusion of the movie offered up a glimmer of hope. Sometimes a positive ending can be refreshing. Then again, positivity isn't for everybody.
There is a limit, even to the imagination, where our greatest creations meet our deepest fears.
The Fly Remake was written and directed by David Cronenberg. Cronenberg is a celebrated director, well known for his work on The Fly and movies such as Shivers, The Brood, Scanners, and Videodrome. Cronenberg worked in many genres throughout his career, but he's held in high regard among horror movie fans thanks to his body horror films. We start with a genius, eccentric scientist, Seth Brundle, as played by Jeff Goldblum. At an event held by Bartok Science Industries, he meets science journalist Veronica Quaife, aka Ronnie, as played extremely well by Gina Davis. They hit it off right from the beginning. Seth takes Ronnie back to his warehouse/home/mad scientist lab and shows off his world-changing invention, his telepods, which are capable of instantly transporting objects from one pod to the other. Seth describes his machine as something that will change the world and human life as we know it. Seth eventually convinces Ronnie to keep his invention a secret in exchange for exclusive rights to this incredible story. And so it begins. Ronnie agrees to document Seth's work, and the two of them get to know each other. Seth explains that if Ronnie sticks around, she can be there when he breaks new ground and teleports himself. The relationship between Seth and Ronnie is genuine. It probably didn't hurt that Gina Davis and Jeff Goldblum were dating at the time. Their on-screen chemistry holds everything together. Seth's initial attempt at teleporting living tissue is a horrific disaster. If you thought a cat transported into oblivion was bad, Seth's pods turn a baboon inside out. After reprogramming the computer, Seth does manage to successfully transport a second baboon. However, before he and Ronnie can truly celebrate, Ronnie heads off, leaving Seth behind, so she can deal with their ex. Now, Seth is a genius, but he's far from perfect. He's insecure, possessive, and jealous. That said, he's very suspicious that Ronnie is hooking up with her ex, Stathis Borans, as played by John Getz. Stathis also happens to be Ronnie's editor. His presence takes this love story and turns it into a shaky love triangle. Although Ronnie is innocent and her departure was in no way a betrayal, Seth just can't deal with it. After a booze-filled pity party, he makes a bad move. He teleports himself, unaware that a housefly entered the pod with him. Seth emerges from the pod seemingly normal. Actually, he's better than normal. He's supercharged. He has increased strength, stamina, and of course, increased sexual potency. Seth is like a walking lightning bolt.
What have I really done? All I've done is say to the world, let's go! Move! Catch me if you can. Waiter! Jesus Christ!
Anyone who has seen this movie knows the remaining portion can be a tough watch. He soon becomes nasty, arrogant, violent, and he even grows mysterious hairs from his back. At one point, Seth insists his pods are all good. He tries to force Ronnie to undergo teleportation. Of course, she wisely refuses, but all that does is infuriate Seth. With that, Seth abandons her. He heads off to a bar, enters an arm wrestling match, and horribly maims a complete stranger. Later, he tries to force another woman into the pod.
Afraid!
Don't be afraid.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
Ultimately, Seth checks his computer records and figures out what went wrong. The computer confused the presence of two life forms and simply fused them with the fly at the molecular level. So he's screwed. Things go from bad to worse as Seth continues to fall apart. Sure, he can walk on walls and the ceiling, which is pretty cool, but he also has to vomit onto his food just to digest it.
That's disgusting.
Seth deteriorates before our eyes both mentally and physically. As if things weren't messy enough, Ronnie eventually learns she's pregnant and Seth is the father. Following a nightmare in which she gave birth to a giant maggot, Ronnie demands Stathis help her get an abortion. However, that plan goes out the window when Seth comes crashing through the window. He eavesdropped on our conversation, so he knew what was up and kidnapped Ronnie before the procedure could take place. Later, Seth pleads with Ronnie to carry the child to term. He feels that's his last shred of humanity. This isn't something Ronnie is willing to do. In the climax, everything goes completely to hell. Stathis breaks into Seth's lab with a shotgun, but Seth takes care of him in a most brutal fashion, using his corrosive vomit to melt Stathis' hand and foot. He's well on his way to finishing him off before being stopped by Ronnie. With that, Seth resorts to Plan Z, I guess at this point. He tries to use his telepods to fuse the both of them into a single being to become the ultimate family. And of course, by this point, we get the now iconic full-on Brundlefly. Seth, or whatever's left of him, then forces Ronnie into the pod, but thankfully, Stathis saves the day. Ronnie escapes, but Seth only partially exits the pod just as the fusion process is activated. And Seth is left even more deformed than ever. He's now fused with the machine itself. As he crawls around seemingly in agony and suffering, he requests that Ronnie put an end to his misery. She tearfully complies. It's a devastating end. Now that I've broken down both movies, let's go deeper on the 80s remake, and along the way we can discuss the differences and similarities between the two movies. Cronenberg's remake of The Fly takes you on an emotional roller coaster ride and leaves you in a pit of despair. He reinvented the core story and truly made it his own, something fitting for a new era. His updated adaptation is a gripping and relentless assault on the senses. The original movie exceeded my expectations, but this movie melted my expectations. Gina Davis was great. This was a part that must have been emotionally demanding, but she knocked it out of the park and firmly grounded this insane story. Jeff Goldblum was a real standout. He added so many great little visual twitches and tics that helped bring this ever-mutating character to life. One aspect of the 1958 movie that the original writer, Charles Pogue, wanted to change was the lead character's inability to speak after his transformation. In an interview, Pogue noted that once Andre could no longer talk, he was rendered a passive protagonist. Thankfully, Jeff Goldblum didn't have to worry about being stuck under a hood or rendered mute. Seth was capable of articulating his struggle throughout his entire transformation. But that's just one of many ways Seth Brundle was different from the lead in the original movie. Andre DeLame was an optimist and an idealist who aspired to greatness. He was also a happy-go-lucky family guy who seemed to find a nice balance between work and family life. For Seth, however, his work was his life. Seth was also a genius, however, he seemed like more of a recluse. He's charming, but in an awkward way.
Nice.
In comparison, the original cast feel a bit more like products of their time. But that's not a bad thing at all. It's all part of the charm. There's a love story at the center of each movie, but they're portrayed very differently. Andre's relationship with Helene was essentially a dreamy Hollywood romance. But with Seth and Ronnie, we follow the birth of a more realistic, modern relationship. The common trait both stories shared was the concept of a doomed couple and their tragic experience. Both leading women were forced to bring an end to the suffering of their loved ones, and both movies pulled off this heartbreaking dynamic very well. I have to discuss the groundbreaking Academy Award-winning special effects. Jeff Goldblum may have spent a million hours in a makeup chair, but it was all worth it. The infamous fly makeup was designed by Chris Wallace. Pretty much everything we see in this movie, from the makeup to the puppeteering, still holds up. This is practical effects at its finest. Speaking of effects, it's easy to see why Cronenberg's Fly is considered a body horror masterpiece. To be clear, the gore in the remake isn't gratuitous. Sure, a lot of it can be tough to stomach, but it all serves the story. Unlike Andre Delam's off-screen and seemingly instant transformation, in the remake we watch Seth's slow, painful transformation every single step of the way. He doesn't conceal his features. We witness his Kafkaesque metamorphosis into Brundlefly head-on. And in my view, this is one of the biggest improvements over the original. The narrative structure of the remake is also very different than the original, and I'm glad the remake strayed from the original framework. This way the story is no longer a non-linear tale that unfolds through flashbacks. That structure worked really well for the original. As I noted earlier, connecting the dots was part of the intrigue. But in the remake, we're in the front seat, witnessing the horror firsthand from start to finish. That linear direction keeps the momentum going, it's more engaging, and it quickens the pace. The original movie worked as an entertaining, cautionary tale. The movie stressed the importance of not overreaching when it comes to matters of science and technology. Cronenberg's version expanded on those same ideas, but also explored themes more relevant to the times. In doing so, the remake did stray further from sci-fi and lean more into the psychological horror genre. But all things considered, that's fitting for Cronenberg. Clearly, he had his own unique story to tell. Some mistakenly thought Cronenberg's movie was a metaphor for AIDS. But in an interview, Cronenberg himself specifically stated, "To me, the film is a metaphor for aging. A compression of any love affair that goes to the end of one of the lovers' lives." He went on to say, "Every love story must end tragically." So, Seth's gradual transformation was a metaphor for the aging process. Although in this case the symbolism was pushed to the extreme, with Seth losing not just his teeth and hair but all kinds of body parts. I don't even want to imagine. One last bit of trivia I wanted to mention in relation to the original script, as written by Charles Pogue. Cronenberg's revised script did retain some of Pogue's basic plot beats. But for the most part, Cronenberg crafted the story into something else entirely. That said, Cronenberg still made sure that Pogue shared screenplay credit. He felt that his version couldn't exist without Pogue's script as a starting point. And I love that idea. Anyone who contributed along the way gets credit they deserve. After all, this compelling story dates back to the late 1950s, and it's managed to change, evolve, and mutate. And in doing so, it's lived on for decades. Ultimately, both the original Fly and the remake are easy to recommend. I prefer the remake overall, but depending what mood I'm in, I could really go either way. The remake is very bleak, but it's interesting and engaging the whole way through. But the original Fly is an awesome throwback to 50s sci-fi, and you can't go wrong with Vincent Price.
So fantastic, words can't begin to describe it.
As far as ratings go, the original Fly gets 4 vintage Fly heads. The Fly remake gets 5 horrifically deformed Fly heads. If you've seen the original and the 80s remake of The Fly, let me know which version you prefer. Also, don't forget, hit like and sub if you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching, be well, stay safe, later.